So yeah, this is Greg. I'm product manager here at GridGain. I'm responsible for Control Center, our legacy tools, as well as our kind of cloud infrastructure, cloud planning. So today what we're going to do is we're going to look at Control Center. We just had a release go out in May. And if you were lucky enough to attend our Ignite Summit, you got to see some of the new features that we introduced around that time frame. But we're going to do a deep dive into a couple of the new features that just came out. And then we'll conclude with just a little demo of troubleshooting, a scenario that we often see with customers. So it might give you some hints as to how you can improve your SQL performance. So just in case you're totally new to GridGain and Ignite, we'll just give you a quick overview of what the Ignite platform is. Then we'll go into Control Center and we'll look at the two new features that we added for this last release. And then we'll do a demo of just kind of troubleshooting a SQL scenario where a query is running slowly and what can we do to make it run faster. So we'll do demos of all the new features, and then yeah, so we'll just have a few slides to start, and then we'll get into demo. So just as a refresher, if you're new to Ignite or you're an experienced Ignite and GridGain user, GridGain and Ignite is our memory-centric data platform that's used to build fast, scalable, and resilient solutions. It's used to add speed and scale to new and existing applications. And the way the kind of layering works is that at the core, we have our open source Apache Ignite project. And so that gives us some of the basic kind of in-memory infrastructure. It gives us distributed memory-centric storage so that we can store giant, massive amounts of data in memory. It gives us the ability to do co-located compute so that we can bring the computations that we might be doing against our data to the servers where the data resides so that we can eliminate bottlenecks, things such as like network problems, disk I/O problems, things like that. And then in the ways that we can interact with the data, we have actually a few options. So one is either via key value APIs or via distributed SQL. A lot of you that are familiar with Ignite and GridGain, if you're using the platform for any kind of like caching or queries, you're probably using it, you're coming from a distributed database background, you're familiar with SQL, so we're able to kind of reuse a lot of that SQL knowledge that you have to access the data, run transactions, and do other things like that. And then in terms of interfaces, there's multiple kind of client technologies that the platform supports. Clients based on Java, based on .NET, C++, PHP, REST, mobile, all different types of kind of interfaces can connect into this in-memory computing platform so that you can take the most advantage of it, integrate it into many different types of use cases. And then built on top of the kind of Apache Ignite core are some additional kind of enterprise features that we provide as GridGain, through GridGain. And that includes things like more advanced monitoring and management capabilities, integration with security, the ability to do in-place upgrades of versions with zero downtime. It's through a feature we call rolling upgrades. It also gives us the ability to replicate the data across regions or across clusters so that you can have high availability across multiple zones. And then also we provide a lot of enhanced persistence features so that starting with that kind of core Ignite, you can introduce persistence for things like data snapshotting, backups, and recovery, so things like that. So that's just the basics of the platform. You've probably attended some of our other sessions of introducing Ignite, so you probably have some sort of kind of understanding of what Ignite does. So let's just drill down now into the tools. And so GridGain Control Center is our current troubleshooting, management, and monitoring tool for Apache Ignite and GridGain. It was launched in 2020, mid-2020, around June, July timeframe. And so the goal of GridGain Control Center is to provide basically a lot of access, information, and transparency into what is happening with your clusters. And so it's a new interface. It's available in a couple of different ways. You can use GridGain Control Center as a downloadable bundle, which you can install yourself and manage yourself, either via a zip file or via Docker images that we put up on GridGain's Docker Hub. Or you can use Control Center in a kind of SaaS option. And that's, we'll talk a little bit more about that and do some demos of that. In terms of the capabilities that we provide with Control Center, we're looking at a few different kind of user types or communities that we want to provide tools for. So one are the kind of DevOps or admin user. And so with those users, we want to give you a lot of information about what is happening with your cluster at any given time. So we'll give you the ability to connect to and manage multiple clusters concurrently, regardless of the edition of the platform. So whether you're working with Ignite or whether you're working with one of the GridGain editions like Community Edition, Enterprise Edition, or Ultimate Edition, we don't care. We just have one tool that can manage everything. And we can connect as many clusters as we want so that you can just switch between different clusters and get the most recent metrics, define alerts, and status of your cluster. Another thing that's kind of interesting or more attractive to admin DevOps users is if you're using the GridGain editions, we enable you to do we give you some tools to help you with your upgrades so that you can take advantage of the rolling upgrades feature. We also give you tools so that you can perform snapshots on the data. And then if for some reason something happened to your cluster, maybe a node goes down, you need to restore, we give you the tools so you can also do all of your kind of restoration and recovery. Now for developers, we also have a different set of tools or complementary set of tools. And those are in kind of two different areas. One is around giving you tools to help you build your SQL queries. So we have an IDE that I'll be demonstrating when we get into the troubleshooting section, where we make it easy for you to build your queries, analyze your queries, look at the queries that are currently running, and then we also have some tools around tracing. So let me just get a couple of details before we get into the demos. So one is around metrics monitoring. So Ignite and GridGain over the last year have gone through kind of an architectural improvement around the way that we produce metrics. So traditionally, it's been our own proprietary metrics framework, and we make the metrics available via JMX. But now we've also added instrumentation around OpenCensus so that you can pull these metrics and view them in any number of the OpenCensus compliant monitoring tools. Control Center is one of them. And so with that, we now have the ability to build custom dashboards and visualizations around at minimum 200 different cluster metrics. So with Control Center, we want to make it very flexible so that you can create custom dashboards around the use cases that are important for you. So if you're doing more of a caching set of use cases for your cluster, then we can build some dashboards that might show information about memory consumption or your read-write throughput or your thread pools, things like that. Whereas if you're doing more transactional workloads, you would have maybe a different set of metrics that you would want to build custom dashboards around. Or if you're working with compute, you may want to have much more kind of CPU intensive sets of dashboards that will show kind of how your compute jobs might be performing. And so combined with that, we can also build a set of alerts. So Control Center has flexible alerting framework, so we could pick any of these metrics that you might be interested in, define some conditions for that metrics, and then just build out some custom notification channels. So today we support both email and SMS-based notifications. And so another kind of developer-oriented feature that we provide with our tools for Apache Ignite and GridGain is the ability to collect span data from API calls as they execute across your cluster. This is what we call tracing, and this is also based around the OpenCensus standard for kind of application tracing. And so within Control Center, we make it very easy to enable tracing on a cluster. You just simply pick the API that you want to start collecting span data for. It could be cache related, cache reads or cache writes. It could be API calls that are happening around transactions that you might want to collect. Or you may be trying to debug an issue with SQL, and you might want to start to collect the API calls around your your queries as the query is getting broken down into its component parts and executing across your nodes. Regardless of which API you're interested in, we're able to enable this tracing collection without having to restart the cluster. So you simply just select the API that you want to collect traces from, your sampling rate, and then we'll immediately start collecting that information. And then it comes from all of the different nodes in your cluster, and then we combine them together into a single unified view. So it makes it much easier for you to follow the execution as the API runs across the cluster, and allows you to drill down into individual steps of the execution when it's hitting each individual node. And we'll give you some basic information around like timings and things, so that if you have a bottleneck in one of your API calls, it makes it very clear like which step in the execution stack that bottleneck might be happening. And then we can pull in logs and some other information so you can get to the root cause faster. Another area that's useful is understanding how your data is distributed across your cache data is distributed across your nodes. So we have a very targeted cache view, which will give you that information so that as your data is getting distributed across your nodes, you can see how many partitions, whether these are primary partitions or backup partitions. We also will track where that data, if that data has any lost partitions. For example, if a node was to go down, we'll show you which partitions were lost. Presumably, hopefully, you're also combining this with snapshotting so that you have backups, and then you would be able to pick like a restore point and restore those lost partitions. But it's very helpful in understanding kind of how the data is being distributed. It can also help with root cause analysis, because if you had configured your cluster to put all of your partitions on an individual node and you're not distributing it well, that could lead to kind of slowdowns. So that's another way to kind of debug configuration issues with a cluster. So let's talk about what's new. So in our May release, we added a big enhancement to our online version of Control Center. So as I was mentioning before, we have kind of really two different distributions of Control Center. We have the downloadable versions where you download them, install it locally, or install it within your data center, and you manage Control Center yourself. The other option is Control Center as a managed service. So this is where we provide Control Center, where you simply can just bring your clusters, and we will take care of keeping the tool up and running, managing your account, and then storing metrics data that we collect from your cluster, even when you're not logged into the system. And so we've greatly enhanced that kind of hosted version of Control Center, and kind of rebranded a little bit to something called Control Center SaaS. So what that allows us to do now is, before we only gave you about 24 hours of metric storage, and then we would just kind of delete it. And this is because it was just to keep operating costs low. But now we'll give you up to 3 gigabytes of metrics storage. So this should last you weeks, so that you can do longer term trend analysis on your cluster performance. So we simply can go to control.gridgain.com, sign up for a 30-day trial, try it out. You have unlimited usage during that 30-day trial. And then after that, we have a flexible subscription model where you can do either monthly or annual billing. And the subscription is based on essentially the number of nodes that you need to store data from. And it can work with multiple users, it can work with teams. And so we'll get into that in a moment. So the second major feature that we added in this recently is something that we're calling teams. So the idea with the experience with Control Center for the last 8 months or so has really been a kind of a single user experience. So you log into Control Center, you create your account, and then all of the artifacts that you create in that account is really specific to your login. So any dashboards that you create, all the connections that you're setting up to the cluster, the queries that you define, any backups that you've configured, all of that is really tied to the logged in user. But we know that at least from the Control Center installations that we see that are happening on premise, it's always a team that needs to, or multiple users that need to be able to log in and connect to and manage those clusters. Typically, multiple IT members. And so we added this idea of a team where we can take multiple accounts, link them together into a group, and then what we do with that is allow you to share your configuration artifacts. So for this first release of Teams, we are enabling you to group users into a team, and then share your cluster connection. So you only have to configure the connection to the cluster once. You share that connection, and anyone that logs in as part of that team will see the cluster in their clusters view. So today it's just cluster connection sharing. In the future, we're planning to add additional artifact sharing. So I think an important one will be the ability to share the dashboards, because these dashboards are very custom, and you can have as many dashboards as you want. So you might have, one user will create one set of dashboards that are specific to a use case. A different user will create a separate set of dashboards that might, maybe one is more memory centric, one is more storage centric, and you want to share them across the team. So then you would just select individual dashboards, share them to the team, and then everyone can see all of the different dashboards whenever they log in. We also want to provide a similar sharing among queries. And so when you're defining your queries, you may have some common queries that you want everyone to be able to use. And so we would, that's another kind of roadmap feature, is we want to be able to take queries that you may have defined and then share them among your team so they will show up in their individual SQL queries used as well. We've also applied this idea of teams to subscriptions. So if you're working with the online version of Control Center and you've subscribed to an account to manage multiple nodes in your cluster, you can share that subscription across your team members. So and you can have as many team members as you want on that shared subscription. So we'll do a demo. So let's take a look at a scenario where we have a SQL query that might be running slowly for some reason. And so what I'm going to do is I have a local Ignite cluster that's running. I'm just running in an embedded mode. I think it's version, it's Ignite 210.0. And so I've already loaded it up with a bunch of data. And then we're going to run some queries against that data set. And we'll do a couple things with that. So first we'll run the query. We'll see if it's how it's performing. Is it completing? We'll see, once we complete that query, what's the statistics on it? How long is it taking to complete? Is it succeeding or failing? And then we'll look at some information about how the query is executing. So within our queries view, we can get into things like explain plan. So we can see how the query is being run. And then once we get into the explain plan, we'll look at see what we can do to try and improve that performance. And so in this case, we'll look at adding some indexes to that data set. And once we've added some indexes, then we'll run it again and see if we get some improvements in our performance. So that's the basics. So let's switch off of slides and let's get into a few different demos. So looks like my cluster is still running. So this is IntelliJ. I just have a very simple Ignite cluster that I'm running. We already loaded it up with a bunch of data. So it looks like it's fine at the moment. So now let's go into my Control Center view. And so let's see, let me log out first. Okay, so this is our hosted version of GridGain Control Center, Control Center SaaS. And so this gives us a very easy and a fast way to get started managing our Ignite and GridGain clusters. Simply need to sign up, you provide username and email, password, some basic contact information, and then you can just provide your cluster ID, and that will get you started immediately. So I already have an account. I've set up an account. We have also account OpenID Connect integration, so you can just provide your Google credentials or your Microsoft Azure credentials and get started even faster. So once I log in, I can see I do have my local connection. It's just a single node cluster. It's using Apache Ignite 210. So it looks like it's online. Let me just switch to the dashboard and confirm that we do have some data that's getting pulled in here. Let me just restart the cluster quickly, just so we can make sure everything is fresh. So while I'm waiting for the cluster to start, let's go back and look at some other things. So once I've logged in, I can manage my clusters, but I can also take my cluster information, or I can also start to organize some team members so that we can share some of the content that I've added in my account. So I already have one team member that I've added, which is just an alternate email address that I have. But I'm going to add another member. In this case, I'll add Venkat. So let me add Venkat's email address. So then Venkat, he already has an account on control.gridgain, so he should just see a notification basically that he's been added or invited to be part of this PM team group. And so then the next time that he logs in, he should see that he's been added to teams. And then once I start to share some content, he'll start to see that in his account as well. So it looks like this thing is up and running. So I've got, it's active. So now I'm going to just say here, let's share. Let's share this cluster with my PM team. And so now everyone that's part of my team will also see this cluster connection set up in their environment. So when they log in, they don't have to go through the copy and paste of like the cluster ID or the cluster token. It'll just be set up for them automatically. So let's now go to the SQL view, and we should see, let me just make sure this is running. Yes, it is. That's great. And now let's look at what we have here in our SQL view. So one of the key features of, especially if you're a developer with Control Center, is the ability to execute and troubleshoot and debug SQL. And so we have an integrated SQL IDE with Control Center. What this allows us to do is based on an individual connection, we can introspect into that connection and look at the schema. So these are the tables that we have in this current example. And so we have a table called person, which has just a few columns on it. We can see how these tables are distributed across our caches. And then we can also see the nodes where this data is being run. Now, remember, I only have a single node cluster, so I only expect to see this information happening on this one node. So let's first of all, let's see how big our data set is. So let's just see how many rows we have in this person table. So we have it's pretty good. We have about almost 900,000 rows, so 900,000 people in this person table. So if we were to run a query, let's, for example, say, let's just do a select all from person. We should start to get some return data. And so we can see here, we've got some basic users here. So we can scroll through some of the results. But we'll be scrolling for a long time to actually view the entire data set. And so let's switch and let's see how how this query is performing. So we can see the query is still running. So I have it's in my running queries tab. The running queries tab gives us a view of all of the queries that are currently executing against the cluster. these don't have to be queries that have been started in a control center. These could be any queries. So, if you have queries that are running automatically as part of your application logic, they will also show up here in this view. So it's a very good way to understand, what SQL is actually running against the cluster at any given time. And so it gives you some information about the query that was executed. You can see some additional information about the query, such as what were the configurations around join, are distributed joins supported, is lazy loading configured when you executed the query, and then how long has the query been executing and which schema was it run against. So I can see here this one has been running for a little while, and it may not actually complete because of the way I've kind of configured the cluster. So one thing I might want to do is kill the query. So we have a tool so that we can stop queries that maybe either got stuck or are running too long or anything like that. So I'm actually going to go in here and say, let's kill this. Now, similarly, we may want to look into some statistics about these queries as they're running. So we can get some information about each query that executed against this connection. So I can see here the initial query that we ran, getting the number of rows in the person table. It took 800 seconds, so it took a little bit amount of time. We can get some more information about the query that occurred, and then we can also get some additional information by loading the explain plan. So let's go back and run some more queries. So based on that initial run where we were returning all from person, we see we've got a couple of email addresses. So let's just do a search based on an individual email and see how long that takes. So I'll just pick one of I think it's the first email result, the second one here, this Zachary Herzog. Let's see how long it takes to find this person against this data set. Okay, so we can see the details it completed successfully, and then we can see how long it took. So let's go into the explain plan. So it took about 2 seconds. So once we go into the explain plan, we can get some more details about how this query executed. We can see the details of the MapReduce statement that occurred. And so we see the breakdown of how this select statement is kind of internally implemented within Apache Ignite. And we can see when we do the search, we're doing a scan query. So that's actually a slower way of doing querying, of doing a search. We may want to speed that up by adding an index. So I have a statement here where I can define a new index for the person table, the person cache. So let's try adding that index. This may take a while because we're going to index all 890,000 rows. But once it does, we should get a slightly improved performance. So let's now run this this query again. So now we'll execute. Look, it actually came back quite a bit faster. So now if we go back into our query statistics, we should see yes. So what happened was the first time that we ran, when we were doing a scan query, it took about 2 seconds for the query to complete, to search for that email. The next time after we added the index, it only took 2 milliseconds. And so let's look at the explain plan to see what happened. So now we see when we're doing the query, it's actually using the index and then is able to find that email address. So what did we do? We looked at some ways that we can, we looked at running queries tab to see if we have existing queries that might be taking a long time. We looked at how we could stop a query that might be paused or might be performing poorly or might be stuck or something like that. And then based on the data set, we added an index to try and improve performance. We ran the queries a couple of times, and then we analyzed the execution in the query statistics tab and could see that we did improve performance as we added the index to the data set. We also looked at some of the other new features that we've added. So one was the team. So I've added, I have a team here with a couple of users. that are part of the team. I shared my cluster configuration connection so that the next time they log in, they'll be able to reuse my configuration, so they don't have to set it up themselves. And then we also are using our kind of hosted version of Control Center. And so with that, then I can, if I am using a subscription model, then right now I'm in my still in my 30-day trial. But if I wanted to subscribe, then I can set up and set up my plan, choose the number of nodes that I need to manage, select the addition of the cluster that I'm working with, and then choose some billing, whether it's promote monthly or annually, and then we'll manage all of that for you. And this works both for individuals as well as plans that can be shared across teams. So that was kind of the basics. So I just really wanted to talk about some of the new things that we've added, particularly around the online version of Control Center, the Teams feature, and then getting into how we can troubleshoot some different scenarios. If you're interested in more information, you can set up your free account at control.gridgain.com. It's the fastest way to get started managing your clusters. Our documentation, we have a redesigned website that also was launched in May. So you'll see some new use cases that are highlighted, some new scenarios, a new look and feel to gridgain.com. This is the link to our documentation. We have a video series of different troubleshooting scenarios that you might want to check out when you're working with your Ignite clusters. And then if you want to get hands-on, I would recommend you sign up for our training. We have a training that's happening at the end of the month. We run these pretty regularly. And so here's the link where you can sign up. So this will take you through a few different scenarios where you will set up a cluster, set up your control center, and then run through 2 or 3 different use cases. So let's open it up for questions or any other things.
Awesome, thanks, Greg. That was great. We have a few questions. I sent one over to you already. So it's a question about how will Control Center SaaS solution connect to GridGain clusters hosted in a private network?
Yeah, so we need to somehow have a way to connect. So we support SSH, TLS connections, so we can set up basically a secure tunnel between your cluster and the Control Center environment. And if that's something that doesn't work for your kind of corporate security, you can always just download Control Center and run it within your network, and it works the same way. So we have multiple protocols that we support when connecting to the Control Center environment: HTTP, HTTPS, SSH, and others. And really, what we need is just a secure WebSocket connection.
And a related question from Arjit is, how do you ensure data security in the SaaS solution?
Yeah, so we have tenant isolation so that the data that is stored from the metrics is only for your account. So there's no, we don't have like shared, we don't have like a shared schema or anything like that. So we do separate based on the account that's logged in. So there's no bleeding of data across accounts.
Great. And then one question on LDAP. Can Control Center be integrated with LDAP for login authentication?
That's right. Yeah. So we have 2 options. So if you're using like we have a generic LDAP provider integration, and then we have some additional integration for Active Directory. And we have documentation for that on how you can integrate Control Center into that. So then you wouldn't have to use Control Center's kind of user management. You just configure with your Active Directory or with your LDAP, and then the users that have been defined in your identity system can then just log in naturally. We also have single sign-on integration through OpenID Connect. So if you're using maybe like Google or Microsoft as your identity provider, we can integrate with that as well. So that we would just pull the login information from like your Google account.
We have a couple of more here. One is on snapshots. Can Control Center take data and index snapshots? Can it help in loading snapshots back into the cluster?
Yes, let me see, let me just demo it. Let me start a different cluster because I'm using, let's see, the local cluster I have right now is Ignite, which does not have the GridGain Ultimate Edition snapshot. So let me start a different cluster here that is based on Ultimate Edition, and we can show you. Okay. And let's see, did that connect? It's still waiting to connect. So the idea here is that we do have a snapshot screen. You would need to do a couple of things to enable snapshots on your cluster. There's a few cluster configuration options you need to add. One is persistence, and then one you have to add the snapshots capabilities at the XML file at the configuration level. Once that has been enabled, then we can select your caches and do either a full or incremental backup of the data. And then once we have those backups, we can then restore from a specific point in time from a previous backup. We can move the backup information, and we can also analyze it to make sure that there's no problems with it. Let's see, so this cluster is Ultimate Edition. Now it looks like my configuration is missing a couple of options here. So sorry, I thought that my snapshot was, my cluster here was fully configured for snapshots, but maybe it wasn't. But the idea here is then you would just hit create snapshot. You would choose whether it's a full or an incremental snapshot, the compression level, if you do need to compress the data, if it's like a very large data set. And then you'll see like which caches were backed up at which date, and then you can just through a simple couple of clicks, do a restore, things like that.
Yeah, and I believe we had a demo on doing the. I'm just trying to pull the link up here. Oh yeah, I see it now. I'll just post a link for the demo, which walks through Ignite backup management and recovery. Maybe that will be helpful. All right. Let me move on to the next question. There's a bunch of questions. Can we use the tool to assign resource limit, such as memory or CPU usage, by users?
No, not currently. We could set up alerts that would based around resource usage. So like if you have like a storage limit or CPU limit or memory usage limit, we can set up alerts where if something goes past a specific threshold, we send out notifications. But we don't currently have a way to block users limit based on resource usage. That's a good one. Let me write that down.
Yeah, definitely. It's we are definitely looking for ways in which this can be useful for developers and DevOps teams. So if you have anything you're looking for, let us know. All right, here's the next question. Can we see an example of a query execution plan where a call is distributed to multiple nodes and results gathered? Is that something you can do now, or?
Let's see. So how many nodes do I have in this cluster? From my current cluster. Let's see. This is a 2-node cluster with a single client. Let's look in here. Let's try running this. See if this does anything. And then let's see the statistics. Yeah, and so let's try this. Let's also select tracing, configure some tracing. So we will capture, let's try capture the SQL commands as they execute across the cluster. And then let's run this again. So it looks like my cache is only in a single node, but that kind of gives you an idea of how it would work. So if you have your data distributed across, like partitions distributed across multiple caches, when you execute that query, for one, you would see the explain. Let's see. Sorry. You'd see the explain information here. And then if you wanted to drill really down into the details, you could enable tracing. And then you would see how the individual nodes here, you could see the node ID. And you can see when each step, what it looks like when it executes. So it's, you know, for example, like select start from person. And then we can get the breakdown of, you know, how this execution is happening, and once it jumps from like one node to another, when it's doing its map and reduce steps. So yeah, between the explain plans and tracing, you can get all the information depending on what level of detail you need.
Awesome. Thanks. That's good. Here's a question on performance side, Greg. Will Control Center connected to a cluster cause a performance downgrade on the cluster? I mean, what is the performance impact of connecting Control Center to?
So the way that, yeah, so the way that we collect the information is there's an optional library that we ship with your either Ignite or with your GridGain installation. It's called Control Center Agent. It should be in your like libs optional folder. In order to enable monitoring, you would need to add that jar to your libs folder. So meaning the agent would have to live on your class path of each node that you want to you know, pull metrics from. And so in terms of overhead, the only time you might see in performance overhead is if you're doing a lot of tracing, and particularly if your sampling rate is really high. So if you're like right now, I have my sampling rate set to 100%. In a realistic environment, you probably wouldn't need it. You probably want to make it much lower, like under 10%. Particularly if it's for a API that's really active, like maybe your cache throughput APIs or like your transaction APIs, you probably want to keep the sampling rate fairly low. And another way to avoid or to kind of minimize any overhead with respect to tooling is you would only enable tracing really when you need it. You may not really want to collect traces like constantly. It's typically like if you see something going on, you want to drill down into the details, you switch over to tracing, enable the API, run through your tests, collect your spans, analyze them, and then, you know, once you're done and you've resolved the issue, you turn tracing off. But just with respect to general metrics collection, running queries, snapshots, all of that, it's very, very minimal. You should not see an overhead.
Great, thanks. Next question. Is the SaaS solution hosted in different geographical regions or data centers?
Yeah, so today we actually host it in Google Cloud is where the SaaS solution is hosted, and we are investigating running it in other cloud providers. That said, it doesn't matter where your cluster lives. We can manage a cluster that is deployed on-prem, deployed in Amazon, deployed in Azure, or even deployed in Google Cloud. The important thing is that you have your agents configured, and then we've set up the basically the secure connection between the monitoring tool when we configure the agent.
Great. And then a couple of more questions. Can we monitor and manage data center replication using Control Center?
Not currently. That is a roadmap item we are working on. So yeah, that is something that we hope to be adding either later this year, beginning of next year. But yeah, it's definitely something on the roadmap that we're very interested in.
And then maybe related question: can we monitor on monitoring? Can we monitor disk I/O, network I/O, etc. using Control Center?
Yes, all of that is available. So there's metrics available all around storage, and as well as network I/O that you can pull and build build dashboards around. And in fact, we have a tutorial that you can get in the Control Center documentation that does focus a little bit more around the persistence or the disk storage. So you'll walk through building up a screen that looks like this based around persistence. And so it's very easy. Simply, you would just go in if you wanted to build your own custom screens. We have a metric selection UI where you kind of just pick the package, and then you can get into the details about the individual metrics. So things around like storage would be like storage size, or your write-ahead log information, or the total size of your write-ahead log, or your checkpointing sizes. Things like that would all be important metrics to monitor if you're, like, for example, need to look at persistence and storage. So yeah, I encourage you guys, if you want to get more into some individual metrics, particularly around storage, check out our tutorial.
And next question: does Control Center give performance stats of a query that was run in the past?
Yes. So as long as you have configured, well, the short answer is yes. And it just, as long as Control Center is running, you have the cluster connected, then any queries that execute while the cluster was connected will get captured in the query statistics. And
Cool.
so it's particularly useful, like if you're using the controller.gridgain.com, if you leave the cluster connected, then even when you're not logged in, we're collecting all that data. So the next time you log in, you can see, what's been happening while you were away.
And maybe I think the last question is, can Control Center send alert emails as well?
Yes, certainly. So with alerting, we have a couple of options in terms of the notification channels. So here you define alerts around a specific metric. So for example, here maybe I'll say create a metric around CPU. I'll go in here and say CPU load, and maybe send me alert if CPU load gets, I don't know, above like 10% or something like that for a certain amount of time. And then I just choose my notifications. So today we support notifications either that's email based or SMS based. So if you're using the control.gridgain.com, we do have an SMS service that will send out those texts to the target. If you're running Control Center locally, we have documentation on how you can set up the SMS notifications. But yeah, you simply just configure the notification channel, add it, and then once you have violation, then we send out the alerts.
I had a couple of other questions come in. I think we have a few more minutes. One question, Greg, is can Control Center display on heap, off heap, native persistence, memory usage as well?
Yep. So here we have, here in our default configuration, our default dashboard, we do have a table that shows both the heap used versus the on heap, the off heap used, and we break it down by node. So if you want to do that yourself, you could just go in and create a brand new dashboard, add a widget, like a nodes table, and then I can go in and say like, look at my memory, give me a heap used versus off heap used table, and then we got it right away.
And then can it provide client information, like information about
Yeah, so
different
if you're
clients connected to the cluster? Yeah.
Yes, exactly. Yes. So the answer is for the thick clients, yes, because the thick clients actually join as basically a node in the cluster. So we will show all of the details, all the metrics and like performance information around thick clients that are connected. We don't currently have the metrics from thin clients, so that would be something we'll need to that we're looking at.
And then is there any overhead to holding a lot of history for queries? Can the data be set to be stored externally?
We don't have external storage for the data. We do have configuration information in our documentation to expand the data storage amounts. And we also do have some configuration so you can clear it out. Yeah, so just for your kind of information, underneath the covers, Control Center actually has a GridGain cluster running. So that's how we're able to kind of keep things running in a pretty fast manner, is that we're using basically an internal cluster with persistence. But we do have configurations so you can expand the amount of storage and things like that.
And I think that's all I had. Greg, did you have any closing comments?
No, I just want to thank everybody for coming, and yeah, we're really excited. We're continuing to add new features to Control Center. We basically have been doing monthly releases where we add a bunch of new features. So we've got a release probably coming out at the end of this week, beginning of next week. A bunch of new stuff will be coming out, and we'll do another one of these sessions pretty soon, so we can kind of do a wrap up of all the new stuff that we've added.
Awesome. Thanks, Greg. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, everybody.